Now what we're going to do is talk about how, particularly if you have Capricorn rising, and we should explain what that's about. This will apply for people who are Capricorns, but Capricorn rising can be for any sign of the zodiac. You have to find out what that is by the time of birth that you have, the time of day you're born. But this will also apply to Capricorns. And we're going to go through the 12 houses of the zodiac, and each house has a different representation or different piece of life that it represents, and talk about how Capricorn energy handles these different areas of life, what their experience is of it. And of course, we always start at the beginning, which is the first house. The first house of every horoscope shows the physical body and what we look like when we present ourselves to the world. And it has a lot to do with our self-identity, our ego, our self-expression. And we can put the sign of Capricorn there because we're talking about Capricorn. And we've talked about quite a bit of this at this point. It rules the joints. Saturn rules the joints, the bones, the teeth, the knees, ankles, elbows, all the pieces of the body that move and rotate. Capricorn rising, we talked about, has a rather dense bone structure, a thicker skin, and large pores. The rising sign, the first house, is how we present ourselves physically to the world. So you could actually be a Leo personality with Capricorn rising and show a very subdued, very calm, very almost withholding face to the world. In other words, it might take you a bit to get to know people and warm up to them. This is what a Capricorn generally does. Like Taurus, they'll sort of hang out in the crowd and begin to feel comfortable. And then when they begin to feel comfortable, then they slowly move out and they trust a little bit to get to know you. Now, and it's oftentimes one more comment is they'll seem older. They'll oftentimes seem older, not old, not decrepit, but older. So that even a child who's 5 years old that's a Capricorn or Capricorn rising will seem like perhaps they're maybe 8 or 9 or 10. And this will only occur up to a certain point in life, after which it's hard to figure out what age they are because we have that reversal occurring around 45 or 50 where they become younger rather than older. Now we move to the second house of the horoscope. And the second house of the horoscope is always associated with a person's talents, their values, their resources, and the immediate money or cash flow and how they handle money, how they spend it, how they make it. Not necessarily career, but how they work with this medium called money or finances. And we can put the sign of Aquarius here, which is Aquarius was Uranus, the sky god who was chaotic. So it might suggest, since Aquarius has a lot to do with commission work and unpredictability and volatility, that their income is rather unpredictable, that it's up and down. It has the yo-yo syndrome. They may have a lot or a little. I had a teacher once who used to say, if you're born with Uranus, which rules Aquarius, in this part of your chart, in fact, this was Jim Shear in Berkeley, California, and he used to say, this is a person who might live in a cold water flat and drive a Mercedes-Benz. It's full of unpredictabilities and it's full of incongruities, and this is how Capricorn may handle money. They also may be very innovative. They may be inventors. We talked about how out of need comes conception and ideas and innovation. They may be very good at working with information. Aquarius is a sign of public information, computers, video, audio equipment, electronic equipment, working with groups. They may do very well at working with groups. Now we go to the third house, which represents our communications, our style of communication, how we process information. This is also the house that shows our relatives, not our mothers and fathers, but our family relatives as well as our brothers and sisters. And we can put the sign of Pisces here. Now, that would suggest that there's a lot of internal thinking that goes on. Pisces is not what I would call the most verbal sign of the zodiac. It's very psychic. It's very intuitive. It catches everything. But putting it into concrete words is not their strength. Capricorn is not exactly, unless they have a lot of Gemini or a lot of Libra in the chart, and you, of course, have to look at the whole horoscope to see that might be so. But generally speaking, it's not the most vocal sign of the zodiac. In other words, a lot of their communication is done on a psychic level. And if you really know that person, if you're dealing with a Capricorn person, they may actually feel that they have told you something because they're feeling it so intensely, when in fact, they've psychically told you. And whether you're a good catcher or not, that depends on how you hear them. Sometimes you will hear them psychically and sometimes you won't. So one of the lessons they have to work with is taking what the feelings are on the inside and putting them through their mouth and putting them out. They may not discuss a lot of things. They may They may also be very empathetic when they're hearing what you have to say to them. They may not say much, but they're sort of there as kind of a sounding board. And Pisces is a sign of healing and kind of a healing board, so that what you're saying as it goes through them, you feel better after you tell them something. It would suggest that you may have brothers and sisters or relatives that are either extremely creative, extremely musical. Pisces is a sign of music and creativity and dance and theater. Or Pisces is also the sign of alcoholism. They may have problems with denial or family members that are in denial. They may get a lot of their information through their dreams, because Pisces is the sign of the unconscious, and they may get a lot of information in their dreams, and if they're trained to work with that, that can be a very helpful tool. Now, if we go down to the fourth house is usually the signifier of the early home life. In other words, the root family that you came from, as well as all the family members that came before, the family tree, even if you didn't know those people. More traditionally, this house is assigned to the mother. In other words, a parent that might have taken the more nurturing role. In some people's horoscopes, this is sometimes the father. You'll have to decide when you listen to this information. You put the sign of Aries here. Now, Aries is the very first sign of the zodiac. It is an aggressive, warlike sign, which might suggest that the early childhood experience was that one of the family members was very aggressive. Maybe they had a lot of anger or a lot of energy. Maybe very self-centered. The experience of a parent might have been they were very self-centered, very independent, not available when you particularly needed them. It might have suggested that one of the parents, the experience you had, it may not mean that's the way they were, but since it's your experience, it is therefore valid. So this is really important that we know this, because it may not be at all the way they intended to be, but it was your perception, and because it is your perception, it is valid. That the nurturing parent, mother or father, may have constantly been cutting you away, not having time. Might suggest in a positive note that the family was very independent. They work for themselves. Aries is a very independent sign. It may suggest that in the family root, in the family tree, there is a militaristic genetic family tree. Maybe you come from a family of hunters. Maybe you come from a family of military types. Maybe you come from a family of strategists. Aries is a sign of pioneering. Maybe you come from a pioneering root, a group that either were really pioneers or had pioneering ideas, were kind of the first on the block to do things. It might suggest that this was a very active family experience, that they were always on the go, which for a Capricorn, that might be kind of tough, because Capricorn is an earth sign. It kind of wants to sit, take things in, digest it, and then move on. The Aries on the fourth would say, let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go. So the experience might have been you were in a car a lot, or you were traveling with your family a lot. It also might suggest, since Aries, which is ruled by Mars, which rules knives and guns, that there might have been a violent family experience. It might have suggested that if it wasn't a violent family experience, the positive side would have been a family that encouraged you to be brave and try things in the world and kind of move further than your peers and your mates. Going to the fifth house. The fifth house is the house of our children that we birth, as well as children of our minds. That's why we also call it the house of creativity. It also shows how we are in love relationships and romantic relationships, but not necessarily long-term relationships. There is a difference when you look at a chart. There's one house, the fifth house, the next one we're going to talk about, that's associated more with lovers. As we move into the seventh, that's more associated with long-term commitments and marriage. Fifth house, we can put the sign of Taurus there, would suggest that generally speaking, the children that you birth, if you do have children, are generally speaking going to be very beautiful, physically beautiful, who may even have beautiful voices and who will be very expressive. It may suggest that what you consider creative has to make money for you, because Taurus is the sign of money and finances. It may suggest that there's a very fruitful ability to create here, because Taurus comes at the time of the first day of May, the May Day, the Feast of Beltane, when all the flowers are being birthed and all the animals are mating to produce babies and children. So it's very fruitful creativity here. It would suggest that one of the things that really makes you happy is that you like to give pleasure and beauty to the world. You may not be able to express it in words, but by what you do with your family, your children rather, and what you do with your hands or with your creativity expresses that for you. It may also suggest that, when you're involved in a love relationship, it's kind of like you're really there for the person and you have a basic romantic approach to things. and that you may be very seductive in the way you deal with romantic partners too. As you move into the marriage house, which we'll be talking about in a minute, it may not be so seductive, it may be more nurturing. But first, let's go to the sixth house. The sixth house is the house where it shows how we work. It shows how we like to serve people. It shows how we manage our time. It shows the environment, the office environment we may be working in. It shows maybe the area that is a health area, another part of the body that we need to look at. And we can put the sign of Gemini here. Now, Gemini is an interesting sign because it's an air sign. It's a mental sign. It represents 2, maybe 3, 4, or 5, because it is a sign of dualities. And so with Gemini in the house of how you work, you may be a salesperson because Geminis like to talk. May be that you can't discuss feelings, but you may be able to discuss the benefits of the service you have to offer. There is a difference. It's also suggesting that you may have 2 different occupations. Gemini is a sign of 2. It may suggest that the occupation you have has 2 sides to it. One that deals with the left brain, the logical side, and one that has to use the right brain, which is the creative side. It may suggest that you can easily get distracted in terms of your time management. It may suggest that you have very sensitive lungs because Gemini is a sign that rules the lungs, and that it's very important, whatever environment you're in, that the air is particularly clean, that it's filtered, that you have windows that open up for fresh air. It might suggest that the people with whom you work, if you have employees or you're working in an office environment, are people that may not be very organized, that are all over the place, and they depend on your anchor as a Capricorn to keep them moving forward. It may also suggest that you are in an occupation that enjoys serving and helping and bringing people information. Now we go to the 7th house. The 7th house shows us the marriage partnerships that we attract to us, or longer-term committed relationships, or legal business partnerships. In other words, something that has more long-standing quality about it. And we can put the sign of Cancer at this position, which is very nurturing. We talked about that a bit earlier, which would suggest that as particularly a Capricorn rising, you would either nurture your partner or that your partner would nurture you, very much like a mother and child, and that maybe the 2 of you switch back and forth. One acts like the nurturer and then the other one acts like the nurturer. Since Cancer is ruled by the moon and the moon is constantly moving and changing shape, it might suggest that you attract to you partners that are somewhat moody. Partners that are, and moody comes from the word moon. It may suggest that you attract to you partners that are in the occupation of feeding people or housing people or nurturing people, because the moon has a nurturing quality. Cancer is a nurturing sign. It may say that you attract to you people that are familiar with the deep intimacies of people's lives. In other words, it may be that you learn from your partner how to be more nurturing not only to other people but to yourself, since you yourself have had to be a survivor in your life and you've built this crust. You may be attracted to someone quite the opposite who is always nurturing. In fact, your partner may be a person who might not, with Cancer on the 7th house, know when to say no to people. And maybe that's why you're together, because Capricorn sets a boundary and a limit. Cancer doesn't know how to do that. And so there's where the balance, you can learn from each other. They can learn from you how to set limits, and you can learn from them how to be more open and more nurturing. 8th house. The 8th house always shows the money with other people. In other words, by working with other people's resources, we thereby gain our own. The 8th house shows our ability to attract resources from others to us. And it also has a lot. The 8th house is considered to be the house in the traditional astrological belief system that shows death and rebirth. And I'm not saying death where we can read someone's death, because we can never do that. But it shows us how we deal with the issues of death, how we deal with the issues of rebirth and transformation. It's a transformative house. And the sign of Leo can go here, which would say that you have an excellent ability to attract to you that which really makes you happy and joyful, that you would really shine. Leo is the sign of the sun god, the king, the queen, that you would really shine in the area of investments, because this is the house of investments. This would suggest that sexually you're very playful, because Leo is a very playful sign, very relaxed and joyful. It would suggest that in terms of working with other people's resources and thereby gaining your own, it's kind of like your work has to be your play and your play has to be your work. And if the element of play has gone out the door, then you're not really doing something that really makes you happy and you can be very successful at. In fact, This is the area of life in the Capricorn horoscope where you enjoy things, where you really have a lot of fun. And Capricorns look at investment and accruing and amassing security and then letting it go as a game. And they look at investment as a game. And that's why they're usually very successful. And it's an area you can do very well at. If we look at the ninth house is always the house of what we believe in. In other words, our personal philosophy, belief systems. Our higher education shows how we were educated, the experience of higher education, what kinds of teachers we might have attracted to us. And you can put the sign of Virgo here. First of all, I would suggest in terms of belief systems and philosophy that you're probably pretty conservative, pretty reserved, because Virgo is not exactly the most outrageous sign of the zodiac. It's a pretty reserved sign of the zodiac. It would suggest that you have a fairly, shall we say, a systematic philosophy. In other words, this works because this makes sense. This is logical. You look at things in a logical way. If it's not logical, then you don't want to deal with it. It would suggest that when you study fairly precisely and in a very detailed kind of way. It might suggest there might even be a bit of writing ability here because Virgo is one of the signs that is associated with writing. It would suggest that the experience you might have had of your professors or teachers, say at the college level or higher education levels, might have been they too were conservative and they were very picky and maybe very critical. They might not have been critical of you, but you just may have experienced them as critical in general. Now, if we look at the 10th house is always the place of the career. In other words, what we came here to do, how we're being seen in the outer world, our public standing. It's also associated with the father that either raised you or birthed you. You choose whichever person that might be. Sometimes it's the mother, but more than likely it's the father. You can put the sign of Libra here. Now, Libra is one of the more sophisticated signs of the zodiac, so whatever career you choose would have a kind of sophisticated quality about it, and you would be seen as someone who knows their field and is sophisticated in that field. You would be seen as someone who would be intelligent, with good counsel, the ability to provide good consulting or good information, much like the myth of Libra, which is associated with Pallas Athena, who was the consultant to the heroes. And so you would be considered someone who would be fair in the career, and people might come to you to make decisions and act like a judge. You know, Capricorn we talked about was like a judge. Libra rules the law. In fact, the law or the legal system may be one of the professions that you choose to become involved in, as well as a very opposite, although it is also an art form like the law, being an artist or an artisan, because as you recall, if you've heard the stories of Pallas Athena, she was not only the consultant to the gods, but she was also the head weaver in Athens. She was very much a person who promoted the arts. And so someone who has Libra at the top of the chart in the career position would be somebody who might be an artist, who might be particularly good at music or weaving or something that has more of a creative side to it. Libra also vacillates a lot. It goes back and forth, which might suggest you may have a hard time making decisions. It may suggest that your father or the memory that you have of father was that they were sophisticated, all the things that have just been said, but maybe they couldn't decide which side of the fence to be on, and so they would vacillate a lot. It may suggest, too, that you saw the father as someone you well respected and someone, if you read about them, you would really appreciate them, but you really didn't know them emotionally, because one of the issues with Libra is learning to be in touch with feeling. Talking about it is one thing. Being in touch with it is a different thing. And that's also one of the challenges of Libra. So the father, sometimes the mother, but mostly the father, might have been someone that maybe intellectually you could deal with, but on an emotional heart level, there had to be some work done there. And ultimately, as you get older, hopefully you work that out. Going to the 11th house is always the house where we have our goals. It shows the kinds of goals we have, the kinds of friends we have, how we operate in community, how our friends treat us, how our friends may or may not be of benefit to us in our personal or professional life. And the sign of Scorpio can go here. Now, Scorpio is probably one of the most intense, one of the most compulsive, one of the most obsessive signs of the zodiac. So it would suggest in terms of your goals, there would be a magnificent obsession. That once you decide what you want to do, nothing would stop you, much like the tunnel vision that we spoke of earlier. It would also suggest that there is a deep, passionate involvement with your friends, that you really care about them, and that they too, since it's a very intense sign, are very intense kinds of people, rather compulsive types. They would be very powerful achievers, both your friends and you. You would have friends that probably would be very comfortable in the world of finance and who would be very good with accruing wealth and using it to make change and transform. Since Scorpio is also the sign of the shaman, the medicine man or the medicine woman, it would suggest that the way you are to your friends is kind of like a shaman, that you would somehow be able, when they're going through rough times or intense times, something about your energy and your information would be able to help them change and transform and help them find their own power. In other words, you, a Capricorn person, may not always be able to empower yourself, but you would have this very, very special gift where you would be very definitely able to empower others, especially those that you really care about and those that you really love. If we go to the 12th house, which is the last house of the chart, the 12th house of the horoscope, I always lovingly call it the toxic waste management station of the Zodiac, because everything has to pass through here before it begins anew at the beginning, the rising Capricorn. And they say that this is also the place of memory prior to birth, right before birth. Some people believe in past lives, and they believe that this is where past life memory is stored. But this is also the spiritual treasure chest of the chart. This is also the blind spot of the chart. The sign of Sagittarius goes here, which does suggest that innate inside of each Capricorn or Capricorn rising is very excellent instinct and intuition. Since it's placed in the blind spot, in other words, behind the head where you can't see it, you may have very excellent instinct, but you may not always see it or recognize it. And this is why we call it your blind spot. This is also where we store our secrets. And as we close this discussion, the secret wish of Capricorn with Sagittarius in the blind spot is to be free, to be carefree, to have fun. And with their schedule in their life, sometimes they can't do that. So what's the answer? First of all, the answer is to get education that will give you information that will help you be more creative and access your creativity. That's one way to do it. And then the other one is a very simple thing. Since Sagittarius is the sign of luck and prosperity, ruled by Zeus or Jupiter, it would suggest that you have to have simply an attitude adjustment. And the way to close it, and remember this thought, there was a book written many years ago by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. And in the book, he talks about his experience in the concentration camps and how, as these people were dying and not having much food and not having clothes and losing their loved ones, and as certain people passed through the rooms of the prisoners, they would hand out bread. And some prisoners, even though they were starving, would find another prisoner that would be even more starving, and out of love and conviction, they would give away their bread. And what Viktor Frankl says in that book, and this is so appropriate for Capricorn to remember, is that in the concentration camps, they could take away from us everything, but the one thing they could never take from us was our attitude.
Hello, this is Georgia Stathis. You've been listening to our archived series, Myths and Signs of the Zodiac, and we thank you. If you liked what you heard and you'd like to know more and hear more, please go to our website at starcycles.com, where you can find an assortment of available tools, pieces of information, and things that you can use in your own practice or in your own study of astrology. Again, thank you so much, and we hope to see you soon.